What is up? It's another day without any commuting. I didn't go to CrossFit today, so I missed out on two drives. I had a bit of a work thing come up last night, and I thought I had to make myself available pretty early in the morning to meet with someone in the UK. Turns out I was wrong. So then I ended up missing CrossFit, but it turns out the workout was pretty crappy anyway, and I wouldn't have liked it. So not all is lost. But I have a topic I'm going to go through from Reddit. I think this one's kind of interesting. Might be pretty relevant for a lot of people because it's AI related. And so I'm going to share my perspective on this stuff. And the question is really just about like what it says, what are y'all actually using Copilot for? And I guess when I go to answer this too, I'll maybe for you to think about like, let's leave it kind of open ended, not necessarily Copilot. Um, I use Copilot, but I also use other things too. I'm not using, I don't know, like Cursor AI or there's a bunch of stuff, right? There's a million things now. So my set of tools is pretty limited that I use regularly. I'll talk through that, um, give my perspective about how I find things are useful, when things stop being useful. And yeah, hopefully that's helpful. And I figured, trying to do a good job of reminding people about this stuff when I get into these videos. But if you want questions answered, just comment below. I'll do my best to do that. A huge shout out. I had someone, man, I should have, I'm drawing a blank now and I should pull it up on my phone. But I had someone actually leave a tip, which is cool. I just got monetized on this channel for the first tier of monetization, which is super cool. Um, and I'm close to the next actual tier of monetization, which is awesome. Oh, sorry, Web Developer Ninja 9220. Huge thanks to be able to put out some content and get a tip for it. I was actually just doing a like sort of I do these vlog entries for my main channel. I've been doing them every week for 2 years now, except for like a couple of instances where either I've been sick or like on vacation. And I was saying in that vlog entry, like how cool it is to be able to have, it doesn't matter what the dollar amount is, but for someone to leave a tip, go out of their way and say thank you, like that means a lot to me. So, yeah, thanks for doing that. But if you want questions answered, leave them in the comments. If you have something more in depth that you want me to go into, just send a message. Look for Dev Leader on social media. And then another quick reminder that if you like this style of video, that my main channel Dev Leader, Mondays at 7 p.m. Pacific, I do a live stream and it's an AMA format. So it's like this, except there's a chat, and then you can chat and I'll answer any questions that you have. I have topics every week that come from my newsletter. It's at weekly.devleader.ca. No, you do not need to subscribe to it, but if you want to know what the topic is for those live streams, it goes out every Saturday. So you have Saturday, Sunday, Monday to check it out. That's the primary topic. And of course, if people have stuff in the chat that they want answered, I focus primarily on that. So, with that said, Copilot, what do I use it for? What other things do I use? So I do use Copilot in Visual Studio. For me, the best use I get out of Copilot and any AI tools right now is basically just glorified autocomplete, which maybe sounds like, well, that's not really that helpful, is it? Like we already had like IntelliSense and autocomplete. Like, what do you really need? Um, but I realize like how much productivity I get out of it now. And I think it's probably a couple of months ago now, but I was coding and for some reason, maybe my internet was down or something. I don't know, but the Copilot stopped working. Maybe it was something with Visual Studio. Who knows? But it stopped working, and I remember I'm like, whatever. Like it's just Copilot. Like great, okay, fine. Let me just keep going. But I felt like, and it was such a weird feeling. I was like, it feels like I'm typing code in Notepad now. And if you've gone from using an IDE with all your bells and whistles that help you kind of just move along and be more effective when you're coding, it just kind of felt like I don't have thumbs anymore. Like how do I write code? Like what am I even looking at? So it was this really weird experience for me where I didn't realize how much I'm relying on Copilot purely from an autocomplete perspective. And I think like for some people, again, they might say, well, that's who cares? Like that's not really that valuable to me, or it's auto completing and it's always garbage or something. But I think the way that like the reason it's working well for me is at least in the code that I'm writing, I find there's a lot of, and it might be a weird word to use, but you'll probably understand. Like, there's a lot of common shapes in my code. And I literally mean, like, if you were to blur your eyes and look at the code, there's a lot of shapes that are common. So, and a lot of these are like different patterns that come up in code, right? So different design patterns. Maybe I'm making a repository, or I have something like a facade that's wrapping different plugins to call into. It could be any number of things, right? A unit of work pattern, like, and whatever. Um, and and because I name things like relatively consistently, I don't know, like, it seems like I go to open up a new file and start creating a class. I start typing a little bit, and it like seems to do a pretty darn good job of predicting what I want. And many times it won't have the right, big blob of text that I want to go do. Maybe the method that it's suggesting, I don't even want that. So I'm like, cool, let me just like type a different name for the method. And as I'm changing it, it's like sort of rewriting the code that's inside. And a lot of the time it's pretty close, at least to the shape I want. And again, maybe it's just like how I'm writing code, the fact that I'm using C sharp or just the patterns and stuff I use. But even if I let that auto complete and I go back and I'm just tweaking a few things, it's actually significantly faster than me just typing everything by hand and going line for line. Um, Maybe part of the reason for that too is like if there's boilerplate or whatever else going on, it's almost like I'm getting this second pass of like reviewing the code, if that makes sense. Like the code is written and I'm going, now I'm reviewing and updating it versus me just typing it for the first time and going through. So I genuinely find that just that alone, using Copilot and Visual Studio, is speeding up my productivity tremendously from an autocomplete perspective. So I love using it for that. Um, I actually did a podcast interview today with someone named Alex Lau, who is a an author of a book. It's but in the conversation we were talking about AI tools, and we talked about like how are we using AI tools. So it's kind of fresh in my memory to talk about this. But he said, "Hey, like, what about that feature where like you can basically in Visual Studio you can kind of pull up the chat and like ask AI, like you can prompt it in a chat to like do something with code." And I said, "I actually don't use that." And it seems kind of silly because it's not that I don't use it for the use case. I find for some reason the autocomplete is lightning fast, and that chat integration is like dreadfully slow. It's slow enough that I actually just work outside of Visual Studio and Copilot for this part. So instead of like opening up the Copilot chat and asking questions about my code, what I generally do is I just open up a chat GPT window, I type a prompt, and then I copy and paste code in. It's like the same thing, it's less integrated, and I think it works for me because the responsiveness is way faster. I don't know why that approach in Visual Studio is so slow for me, especially given that the autocomplete is like so fast. But I don't know. So like it's not that I don't want to use it. It's just right now the functionality is not lined up with what's effective for me. So I don't do that. But I do use ChatGPT in that case. And again, I should call out I'm not like this is not for work. So I am not using like taking Microsoft's code base and dumping it into ChatGPT or anything like that. This is for my own stuff, my own development outside of work. Anything that I'm making, I don't care if AI wants to learn on it. So be it. I don't have any trade secrets up here for proprietary algorithms that I don't want people having access to from AI being trained on it. So whatever. If that's a concern for you, then think about what you're doing and what you're sharing. So something to think about, but not really a factor for me. Um, but what types of things am I using in that scenario where I'm saying, "Hey, Copilot," well, not Copilot in this case, but "Hey, ChatGPT," because that Copilot path is kind of slow for me. Like, what am I asking it to do? And there's a handful of things that I find. A less common one, but I still use it, is asking it to refactor code. Um, and there's going to be a theme in some of the things that I'm going to talk about here. But I'll ask it to refactor code sometimes. To give you an example of what that looks like, so in C Sharp, if you're not a .NET or C Sharp developer, you might not totally get this reference, but there's something in C Sharp called LINQ, Language Integrated Query, I think is what it stands for. I think so. And basically, if you're working with collections of things, you can basically have this. It almost looks like a streaming API. So instead of necessarily working with materialized collections, which you still can do, you can basically stream data through almost like a pipeline. So very succinct syntax. You don't have to think, instead of writing out like a for loop, like for each one of these things go do something. The thought process is like you're basically doing like map reduce kind of operations and filtering like in your language integrated query. So it's pretty nice. It's succinct, but historically there's been performance overhead with LINQ. I think in every time there's a new .NET version, I think all this stuff gets way faster, which is cool. But there is overhead for using it. So there have been some situations where in my code base, I've written LINQ and it's on a hop path, and I will say, hey, like, hey, ChatGPT, here's some code, refactor this to use no LINQ and instead use materialized collections. And one of the reasons that that works really well in those situations is like there is a basically like a guaranteed finite set of data that we could be working with. So there might be queries that only ever pull up to like 100 records at a time, right? I'm not going to accidentally stream an entire database of records into memory. Maybe there's 100 records at a time. So I'm like, just go pre-allocate the 100 record list. Like, just go do that. And then I don't need LINQ to basically on the fly go, oh, let me keep resizing a list or something. Just little things like that. And I can ask Copilot, like, hey, just go refactor this to have loops instead, pre-allocate the collection sizes, and consider performance, right? Like basically prompting it, like, this is a performance critical code path, go do it. Now, can I do that myself? Absolutely. Do I care enough to do that myself? No. Do I find that interesting to do? No. So again, you'll see a bit of this pattern coming up. It's like things that I understand how to go do it, but I don't want to spend the time on it, and it's not interesting. So if I can ask like AI to do it, great. And then I spot check it, right? Like because I know what to look for. It's just I don't want to go do it. So that's one use case. It's actually less common. That was one of the more common things in the beginning, but it's less common now. And again, not because I don't find the value in it. It's just because I have other things I do more. So one of the next things is like I talked about this before, but a lot of .NET and C Sharp developers use something called Entity Framework Core. This is an ORM, which is an object relational mapper. So when you're taking data from a database and you want to map the data into like records in memory to work with, that's what you use an ORM for. So Entity Framework Core is the most popular one. They've basically structured things in a way that you don't even have to understand SQL. You don't have to even see a SQL query ever necessarily, and you can use Entity Framework Core and use it effectively, and it's great. I don't like using it, and I don't like using it. And this is a me thing. It's not like I'm saying I think Entity Framework Core is great. It's just not for me. I'm out of practice with it, so that's arguably the biggest reason why. So that's my bias. I need to acknowledge that. I'm not practiced with it. I use something called Dapper, which is another ORM, and Dapper and Entity Framework Core can do this, by the way. But Dapper allows you to write your SQL queries in code, and then it will do the mapping for you. So there's a significantly less like magic. I can call it magic in Dapper, and compared to Entity Framework Core. And I like having my SQL queries in my code. Some people are very much against that. They're like, I don't want to see that. We shouldn't have to think about that. It's totally cool. I'm not here to tell you one way is right or wrong. I'm just telling you what my personal preference is. So you understand where I'm coming from on this. Now, I like SQL queries in my code. Do I like writing SQL queries? No. Do I like optimizing SQL queries? Even more, no. I don't like doing that. I just like making sure I have them because I can read through them, understand what's going on. Like, I like that stuff not feeling like magic to me. That's my bias. That's my opinion. Is what it is. And I bet you, if I could use Entity Framework Core very effectively, I would change my mind. But I can't. I shouldn't say can't. I cannot currently because I don't practice doing it. But it's a bit of a vicious cycle because I go to build something and I'm like, it's a pain in the ass. Like, let me just go back to Dapper. So this is another example. I will take stuff, and I could even do something like take the table schemas for my SQL database. So copy some tables into a prompt, and then I will say to ChatGPT, I need to write a SQL query. And I could even tell it I'm using C# and Dapper. I want to minimize round trips to the database, and I would like to query data that has this shape. Here are the tables, like the schema of them, and then basically give it some rules on like what to match. And because like the naming convention of the columns and stuff with IDs for matching is pretty consistent, a lot of the time it figures this stuff out, which is super cool. I don't have a really good example. Some stuff in Brand Ghost that I'm building has like I don't know, like filter criteria or like things that are related to the schedule based on what I'm doing. And like sometimes it can pick up like, oh, you have an enabled, like is enabled column or something, right? Like, cool. Like, I know that you're going to want, or I'm assuming you want to check that as part of this query. So let me only look for things where it's enabled. Like, I didn't even tell it that. And it's kind of picking up on this stuff. So this is something that I really like using because it gets me a bunch of SQL really fast. More often than not, as long as I give it the right schemas and stuff, it does a really awesome job. There are, and this is maybe kind of where I'll pivot on this example for some drawbacks, but there are absolutely situations where it'll give me back a query, and it's like it's a pretty complex operation I'm trying to do, and I'm trying to be sneaky and like, could I go write this on my own and do like multiple round trips to the database? Like the answer is yes. But I'm trying to like squeeze a little bit more out of AI, and I'm like, hey, look, I know how to do this in 3 queries. Like I want you to do it in 1. I want you to be optimal. I want you to do 1 query, minimize round trips, go do it for me. And it's like, sure, here you go. And it's not quite right. Like it runs, it compiles, I guess compiles, yes. It runs on the database server, but then the results aren't really what I want. So this is where it starts getting a little bit dicey. And I have had some pretty frustrating experiences with ChatGPT doing this where I'm like, okay, like that's not right. And sometimes based on how complex the query is, I actually can't tell where it's wrong in the query. But what I can do is look at the results and say, okay, like, for example, this column is duplicated across all the rows, and I'll tell it like, hey, it shouldn't be. And sometimes, like something that simple, it's like, oh, like, thanks for pointing that out. And it will go regenerate part, like, a small part of the query it fixes, and then all of a sudden everything's great. Cool. So that's a pretty happy path. I don't mind if I have a couple of back and forth things like that. Where it gets frustrating though is like where it corrects something like that and then breaks something else. So then I'm like, okay, like you fixed the thing I said, but now this doesn't work. And it's like, oh, sorry. And then it like basically undoes it. And then I'm like, okay, well, now we're back at the beginning. And then it's like, oh, sorry. And then it tries another variation. But the thing is, I'm like, as it's doing this, I'm basically figuring out on my own, like what's wrong with the query as it's doing it. And I'm watching what it's trying to correct. And I'm like, it actually is all over the place. It's almost like it's guessing at what to go fix, kind of like I would be doing. Um, Except like in this situation, I'm like relying on it to like realize like what's wrong with it. So that ends up being a pretty frustrating experience. And sometimes what happens is like it goes so far down a path, I can't get it back out, if that makes sense. So I've been prompting it. I'm like, no, you're still doing it wrong. Like this column needs to be like this, or this thing needs to be changed like this, or these dates aren't being filtered. And it's like, oh, like, okay. And then it keeps trying and it keeps like going down this rabbit hole. And I'm like, we can't get back. Um, so there are times like that where like I'll basically just close off that conversation and then I'll start something brand new so that it doesn't have all that context. And then I try to take some learnings from that conversation. I'm like, okay, I saw that it went down this path that I couldn't get it to recover from. So maybe I can structure my initial prompt to like keep it from going so far down that path, like right from the beginning, so it knows to kind of avoid it. So I've had a little bit of success with that, but um, overall, it's tremendously helpful for SQL queries. It's just that I've had some frustrating times, like trying to salvage the conversation. Um, so that's like one huge use case for me is SQL queries, and another one that I'll mention, and it's actually very similar in terms of how it comes up, but it's regular expressions. And if you're sort of newer to software development and you're like, well, what's a regular expression? You're in for it. Regular expressions are used for basically like pattern matching in string data. And instead of doing like, does this string contain like this substring, just as an example, you can do things like you use pattern matching to say, like, does this string have this shape of data somewhere in the string? And so regular expressions can get outrageously complicated. They can have huge performance implications because of how they're structured. Like there's so much room for things to go wrong with regular expressions. But in a bunch of stuff that I've done, like so, my background from before Microsoft was creating digital forensic software. So I spent a long time looking at unstructured data and sometimes very structured data, but looking at data basically and saying like, what is the pattern to pull out, something contiguous that we can make sense of? And if it's not contiguous, how do I jump around and get the right parts to make it structured? So I spent almost a decade doing that kind of stuff in some capacity. But regular expressions are a thing that like, I'm not an expert by any means in the syntax, but conceptually they make a lot of sense to me in terms of like when I would want to use them or when I think something like a regular expression would be helpful. So I use regular expressions for a bunch of stuff. But like I said, I'm not an expert in the syntax of working with them, right? It's not something I use so regularly that like I ought it's like muscle memory, like just like comes out of my fingertips and I write perfect regular expressions. Definitely not. So my normal pattern is that I would go to use a regex visualization tool. I like using regex hero for like .NET regular expression matching. Give it some sample input, give it start typing the regular expression. I can see it visualize the matches and stuff, and that works great for me. But and I use a bit of this is actually a mix between Copilot and Visual Studio and ChatGPT. For the basic stuff, sometimes directly in Visual Studio, I could have an example of a string. To give you an example, maybe I have a URL and I want to pull out some parts of the URL. Just making up an example. That might be straightforward enough that like I can put like / for a comment, put the URL on a new line. I could do / and say like use a regular expression to extract, this shape or part of the URL, and then press enter, and Copilot will go, okay, like make a new regex. Here's the pattern and stuff. So that works pretty well for simple stuff. And I personally have found that it does a really good job with regular expression creation. And then for more complicated things, like I can do the same type of thing, but I just type it into a ChatGPT chat. And I'll say, hey, I'm writing in C#. I need to use a regular expression to extract this type of data from some type of input, whatever it happens to be. And then say something like, create a regular expression that can do this. Here is like a bunch of examples of input, and does a pretty good job. I think it does an even better job if you can say, here's the input, here's the expected output. Then I can do an extra good job. But I find that both of these tools, ChatGPT or Copilot, for me work very well for regular expressions. Sometimes I do have this same type of issue where it goes down a rabbit hole where I'm like, hey, you're matching this thing now, but you're not matching this other thing. And it kind of flip-flops back and forth. That's kind of frustrating, but overall pretty good. So my use cases primarily, are around refactoring, SQL query generation, especially for optimizing them to do them in single round trips. Because again, sometimes I'm like, I'll look at my code and I've written, a bunch of code over time, and I'm pulling data from, a couple different methods, and I'm like, wait a second, like that's, 2, 3, 4 round trips to go get this data. Like, can I do it in one? Hey, ChatGPT. So that's a use case for me. And then regular expressions are another obvious one. Um, Other than that, like those are I would say like the main things that I do like very regularly. Um, I think there's been like something that I want to use it more for, but um, it's kind of hard to trust it, and I'm not exactly sure like why that's the case. Is like sometimes if I need to experiment with building like a new feature in Brand Ghost, just to give you an example, I'm like, hey, I want to interact with this API, or hey, I want to build a system that does something like whatever. Um, Sometimes I feel like and maybe it's my prompting isn't good enough, but I feel like I'm not getting answers that I feel good about. Especially if I'm like, hey, like I want to use an API for something. Sometimes it just makes up the API, and I'm like, okay, like that's not real, so it's completely useless. So stuff like that is kind of like why am I using AI for that? But I do think sometimes for idea generation it can be kind of handy. So um, if I generalize classes of problems, sometimes it can help me think about things. So to give you an example, I might be able to say, "Hey, um, I have a service that can be multiple instances, and I have a situation where I have in normal use cases, I have one producer for a queue and multiple consumers. I need to make sure that only one consumer can ever operate on a message. But there are also some situations where I could have multiple producers and multiple consumers. Like, can you walk me through some different design patterns, distributed systems, things to think about? So having conversations like that is something I'm trying to do more of, I think. And I think part of the reason for that, like why it works really well for me, or why I'm hoping it will continue to be a good use case for me, is that uh, because of how I'm writing software now, like as an engineering manager at Microsoft, I don't write code. And that means over the past 4.5 years at Microsoft, I have not been writing code. All the code I'm writing now these days is completely outside of work. And I write lots of code outside of work, but it means that I'm like almost in a bit of a vacuum. Yes, I work with a couple of other developers on some of the things that I work on, but we almost like, because we're a small team, like we work on very separate pieces. So I'm finding over the past few years I'm getting less like input, if that makes sense. So it almost feels like a bit of a vacuum. And what I'm trying to do is make sure that I can leverage AI to say, like, cool, like, if I stay in my vacuum, I will keep building software that kind of looks like this. So how can I disrupt some of that flow? Right? How can I get more ideas injected into this? Um, because I think that's probably just something I'm lacking from how I'm writing code in terms of my environment. So I will continue to do that. But definitely curious, I think those are my primary use cases. Definitely curious to hear from you. Like, do you use completely different tools? Do you find that different LLMs, like between ChatGPT and Claude and whatever else, like are they giving you like noticeably better or worse results when you're using them? I'd be curious to hear about that. But yeah, the tools, the use cases, all that kind of stuff. If you have examples of that, please leave them in the comments if you made it this far in the video, because I think it would be neat. Like again, one of these things I can learn from you guys in terms of what you're doing. But yeah, I hope that's kind of interesting. Those are the primary use cases I have. I only expect they will grow. So yeah, I'm kind of excited. I think AI is fascinating that we can leverage tools like this for productivity. So we'll see where things go. So thanks so much for joining in. Remember, Mondays, 7 p.m. Pacific on the main Dev Leader YouTube channel for a live stream. Hope to see you there. Show up in the chat, ask me questions, say hello. Would love to chat with you. Take care.